Hi guys, it's Price. So I decided to go ahead and make a video called Bodybuilding from A to Z. Basically just a bit of a comprehensive guide on how to get started with bodybuilding and strength training throughout the various stages without overcomplicating things and focusing on things that don't really matter at those various stages. So the first one I'm going to be focusing on is novice lifters. So that would be from 0 to 6 months of training. And then later on, I think I'll probably make videos regarding beginners, which is about 6 to 18 months of training, intermediates, which are 18 to 36 months of training, and then advanced lifters, which I'm just lumping into anybody with more than 36 months of consistent training. First off, going on the actual training plan, what to prioritize when it comes to being a novice. So I have a few things that might seem a little bit unconventional, but I'll explain why, and I think you'll see the logic there. The first thing you need to note as a beginner, a novice, is as long as you're doing any reasonable strength training program, you're going to make pretty rapid progress at this stage. The reason for this is because you're so far from your genetic threshold and your potential for strength and muscle mass that it takes very little stimulus for your body to continue to adapt and respond. So this is a great thing. It means that every workout you can potentially add 5 to 10 pounds to your lifts, generally speaking, and this adds up pretty quickly. So within the first 6 months, you could be seeing pretty rapid strength gains. But at the same time, I encourage you actually to be a bit more conservative with that than you think. It's easy and it can be easy and very tempting to fall into the trap where you're just deciding to try and progress as fast as possible at the expense of other athletic qualities. And that can quickly get to a place where you are strong enough to hurt yourself, essentially, because you haven't really learned the technique needed to prevent injuries. So I recommend prioritizing a few different things. I would say basic strength, mobility, technique, and connective tissue health. So when it comes to basic strength, at this stage, the very early stages, you should just be learning the very basic movements. So in that case, it would be squat, lunge, hip hinge, press, pull, rotation, and gait, which is walking or loaded carries, fall into that category. And the idea here is that while later on you may need more of an isolation work, and I think it's very common that beginners will do things like curls, calf raises, whatever, that I think it's more practical just to learn the most foundational movements, get your very basic movements nailed down, and then later on worry about adding in these more specialized movements and becoming a little bit more focused with your training. At this point, you're just trying to be very generalist. Another thing I would emphasize is mobility training. So a lot of people, particularly in westernized societies, come from a place where they have become very stiff and immobile because of modern lifestyles that don't require us to be very mobile. So you may have, tight ankles and hips, so you can't squat very easily. You may have discomfort pressing overhead. And at the very beginning, this is really important to focus on your mobility, because as you get stronger and you add more muscle mass, that problem is only going to compound itself. And having poor mobility is a pretty high injury risk. It's something that's always going to matter with lifting, and the stronger you get, the more it's going to matter. So you really want to build those habits early. It's much easier to build and then maintain something than it is to fight for it when it's a little too late and try to reverse engineer it. And I can say personally that most of my injuries have, at least in part, been because of poor mobility. Going off of that, technique is extremely important. This is again why I emphasize focusing on basic lifts only, because you need to master the technique. Again, this is something where as you get stronger, any errors in your technique are really going to compound. And while you may not hurt yourself necessarily at this stage, later down the road, these faults in technique are going to become pretty massive. As well as doing that, focusing on building technique in basic movements is just going to make you a lot more competent in these specialized movements later on, because there is a fair amount of carryover. The final thing I would say is focusing on connective tissue strength. So this is something that a lot of beginners don't foresee because it's not as obvious, but you can get to a place where your strength and muscle gains are way outpacing what your connective tissue can handle. So your ligaments, your tendons, etc. So eventually, with outpacing the connective tissue strength, creating that big gap, you can get to a point where your connective tissue just cannot withstand the loads that you're putting it under, and that is a recipe for disaster in terms of injury risk. And one way I would urge you to focus on connective tissue strength is, again, work on not necessarily progressing as aggressively as possible, but more of a consistent progression, doing a little bit of a variety of rep ranges. So I recommend, 4 to 10 reps with 2 to 3 sets so that you're modifying the volume a little bit and actually giving your connective tissue some time to catch up with your muscular gains. And this is going to pay dividends in the future because the stronger your connective tissue is, the stronger uh, you can be without getting injured. Like the higher your potential strength will be later on the road. So, as for things not to worry about that I see a lot of novices worrying about or thinking is important, I would say don't worry too much about hitting high training volume. There's two reasons for this. One is simply that you don't need it to adapt. At this early stage, you can get away with pretty low volume and still see progress and still see improvement in your lifts. So if you're getting away with less and you're still getting the results that you want, there's no reason to pile on more than you need. Another thing is the reason that you see a lot of these intermediate, more advanced lifters training with more volume, besides the fact that they just need that stimulus to keep improving, is that they have built up that tolerance to that workload over the years. It takes a long time and takes incremental improvement to be able to handle those higher volume working sets and handle that volume and workload without getting injured. With each step, I generally recommend adding, you're going to add more total volume, but it's something that you can do in baby steps. So just don't worry about piling on the volume all at once. Tying into this, I think that having lots of isolation work at this stage is not necessary. The only exception to this rule, I would say, is if you have a glaring weakness. So let's say you're trying to do vertical pull training and you find that that is a huge weak point for you. It's far below the rest of your lifts comparatively. So say you can't do a single chin up, but you're relatively strong everywhere else. Then I would recommend incorporating a bit more isolation work just to bring that pattern up to kind of make it even with everything else, because having a glaring weakness like that can be an injury risk. But otherwise, I think isolation work is very important later on, but at this stage, it's not strictly necessary for the most part. And then going with that, increasing the intensity too quickly. I kind of went into that earlier, but the gains are not going to go away if you approach them more proactively and slowly. Again, because it's based on proximity to your maximum genetic threshold. If you achieve the same numbers in 2 months or 4 months, it's not as if suddenly they're going to evaporate. So don't think of it as a race, think of it as a marathon, think of it as being patient. Going into programming, I try to keep it very simple at this stage. So for strength training, I would recommend 2 to 3 times a week strength work. At later points, you may want to do more. We can get into that at those later stages. But for now, you can do essentially everything you want to do in the week during those 2 to 3 weekly strength sessions. Because you still are not taxing yourself so much, you can train all of those muscle groups all at the same time. Besides that, I recommend having just a base of light cardio. If you're doing nothing else, I say daily light cardio for about 10 to 30 minutes. And what I mean by this is something very light. So I recommend daily walks. No matter what stage you're in, no matter if you're bulking, cutting, maintaining, whatever, it's an extremely low intensity way to maintain basic cardiovascular fitness. If you are somebody who's, for whatever reason, cannot tolerate 10 to 30-minute walks, say you're very obese, for example, there's kind of two routes you can take here. The one route is low impact cardio, which in the short term I think is more relevant. So that would be doing something where you're taking a lot of the load off of your limbs and your joints so that you're not beating them up as much. So I think the obvious choices for that are things like the elliptical, things like stationary bicycle biking, very light biking, and then things like aquatic aerobics, things in the water. However, I do urge you to eventually try to get back to these daily walks just because they are very easy to maintain, and just by logging your step count, you can maintain that basic cardio that you need just to have essential heart health. If you're in a position where you need more intense cardio workouts than just the very basics, then you're going to have to, structure in some more intense programs, maybe some high intensity interval sessions every once in a while. But if you're just somebody who really just wants to get stronger and make sure you're just not getting winded going up the staircase and that you have like a basic cardiovascular capacity, then these walks should be sufficient. Besides that, I recommend daily stretching and mobility work. Again, mobility work does not have to be too taxing on your nervous system, on your joints. And the more limber you are, the better you're going to be at your technique and the easier time you're going to have avoiding injuries. So for a warm-up, I would start with core work. So I would do planks, side planks, and rear planks, as well as some active mobilization exercises. So any areas where you're stiff, I would try to get a little bit blood flowing to that movement, and then just get enough blood flowing throughout your whole body that you're sweating a little, your heart rate is up, but not so much that you're actually fatiguing yourself dramatically. You don't want to get tired from your warm-up. That's not the point. You just want to make sure you're not going into these exercises cold and not have your nervous system primed for lifting weights. So as for the workout, I recommend at this stage you could be able to do a full body every day of your workout. So those 2 to 3 days, you can just do everything all at once. As for the sets and reps of that, I recommend 2 warm-up sets. So I would do something like 50% of what you are planning to lift, and then somewhere in like the 75 to 85% of what you're planning to lift for that day. And again, the idea here is just to have a more specific warm-up for each exercise. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. You're not going to have to rest between sets, most likely, for these warm-up sets. It's just making sure that your body is primed for that movement you're about to do. And then as for the sets and reps, I would recommend 2 to 3 sets of 4 to 10 reps. So you're going to be starting on the lower end of 2 to 4 reps, or 2 sets of 4 reps, or 2 sets of 5 reps. And then you are adding up until you get to the point where you can do 3 sets of 10 reps at that exercise before you're adding weight. Again, this just allows you to be a little bit more conservative with adding load so that you are not, you're giving yourself time to master those movement patterns. There's a lot of rewards that can be reaped just from being patient in this stage, and I think it's really important to just think about you're building your foundation for the next several years of training. As for rest and sets, I would say 90 seconds rest between sets of lower body work because that's more taxing. For the upper body work, I would do supersets. So that's where you're rotating back and forth between one set of each, and about 60 seconds rest between those. Once you've done your warm-up and your core work, I would go ahead and do a unilateral loaded carry. This is training your rotation movement pattern by fighting against rotation. So the two I would recommend, unilateral being loaded on one side in this case, I would either recommend a suitcase carry, which is where you're just carrying a dumbbell, kettlebell, etc. on your side as if it's a suitcase. And this is training your body to resist bending over. The other option, if you have something like a sandbag, is you can do a fireman's carry where it's loaded on your shoulder. So they're pretty similar in terms of their benefits. And for this, you're not going to be doing reps per se, but I would do 2 to 3 rounds of 2 to 4 laps. So just decide what a certain amount of distance is for a lap, and then just continuously progress at that distance. I would go then into a lunge variation. So the lunge is a very important leg exercise that I think is often neglected because people don't really understand its use. It's kind of halfway between a hip hinge and a squat. It's hitting your hamstrings in that knee flexion position. It's hitting your glutes. It's training ankle mobility. And it's training a lot of mobility in your lower body. So I think it's excellent just to start with this. And you're going to find that warming up with the lunge is going to help warming up with the squat. It's going to help warming up with the hip hinge. So I recommend lunges first. Again, for variations, you really just want to do something that's loadable and progressible. So for lower body training, in the most cases, I recommend using weights because it's just going to be a lot easier to progress at this stage. But whether you're using dumbbells, kettlebells, a sandbag, a barbell, is really just a matter of personal preference. With all these exercises, you want to find something that's comfortable for your body. There's a lot of differences in anatomy and access to equipment that you're going to have. And so you just need to do the one that's more practical for you. At this stage, it's very generalist. So as long as you're doing that basic movement pattern, you should be covering your bases. And once you move on from the lunge variation, you go ahead and do a squat variation. Again, I would recommend something fairly heavy on this one. So probably either, double kettlebells if you go down that route. A goblet squat is a good starting place, though, if you really just need to work on your squat mobility. It's fine to start with that. But I recommend eventually moving on to doubles with the kettlebells, so using a pair. Same with dumbbells, similar kind of thing. Besides that, barbell front squats, barbell back squats, sandbag squats, those are all pretty good variations. When it comes to front squats or back squats, again, this comes down to anatomy. I personally found for myself, as somebody with long limbs and short torso, that front squatting was much more comfortable because I was able to keep that upright position much more easily. But if you kind of are on the other side of that spectrum, you might find back squatting to be more comfortable. Really just do what feels better for your body. They're very similar movements and they're going to help each other out a lot. So don't stress too much about, oh, what specific movement is the most optimal. It's really more what's ideal for your situation. Moving on from there, we go ahead and do a hip hinge variation. So when it comes to hip hinges, there's a few options. If you're doing the body weight route, you can do Nordic curls, but I think that's really more relevant for people who are further along in their training. So I would actually discourage that at this stage while you're learning the very basics. I think good mornings can be a good exercise as well. That's where you're, holding the weight higher up on your upper body and then bending over, doing that hinge movement. But at this stage, you're not very strong yet. So that leaves you with kind of the classic ones, which are the deadlift variations. So with the deadlift, there's kind of three main variations you're going to run into. There is the conventional deadlift, which is probably the one you think of, where you're using a straight bar, your legs are inside of your arms, and you're just kind of pulling straight up. It's generally pretty comfortable for people who are longer limbed and shorter torso. The other side of that is the sumo deadlift, which is where you're in a bit more of a squatting position and your legs are on the outside of your arms, but you're still using a straight bar. And oftentimes this is more comfortable for people who are more built for squatting and have the longer torso and shorter legs. Again, it's going to vary. Just do whatever is personally comfortable. And then the third option, which I like a lot for beginners, is just the hex bar or trap bar deadlift. So that's essentially that hexagonal bar where you're just holding a neutral grip and it's very easy just to get into position. The reason I like this is it's not very technical. It's kind of a good middle ground for everything. So if you're somebody who just wants to get stronger or just wants to train this movement pattern but doesn't really want to spend the time mastering it, hex bar deadlifts are a good place to start, because just in order to get into that position, you're going to be getting into a pretty optimal position. As long as you're not just folding your back forward and using a reckless amount of weights, it's pretty uniformly easy for most people to use. So I definitely recommend that if you don't find the bar deadlift variations to be comfortable. There are a lot more variations of deadlifts and hip hinges, but those are the ones I would stick with until you get stronger, and then you can kind of specialize from there. This is when you get into the upper body work. I would start with vertical pulling and vertical pressing, just because they tend to be a little bit less taxing, and so you're going to have enough energy left over for doing the horizontal pull and the horizontal push. So again, you want to do a superset where you're doing one set of the pull, one set of the press, back to back, with shorter rest times than what you would do for the rest times of the lower body. So I would start with a pull-up or a chin-up variation. The other options for this, if you prefer them instead, are doing the lat pull-downs. As long as you're doing that with strict form, I'm fine with it. And then the third option is the pullover. So I particularly like barbell pullovers with an easy curl bar, because it's going to be more comfortable on your wrists and your shoulders. And you should use a decline bench where your head is at the bottom and your legs are at the top. And what that does is it just changes the curve of resistance a little bit, so it's a little bit better for using those back muscles. So any three of those are good. You can just kind of pick the one that feels best for you. But if you're not sure which one to pick, I would probably do a pull-up or a chin-up, just because it's pretty straightforward and it's going to carry over a lot. You would then go into an overhead press variation. Again, at this point, dumbbells, barbells, kettlebells, sandbag, I don't really care what you're doing, as long as you're controlling the weight and pushing it overhead and coming back down, and really using your shoulders or your triceps, and not bending excessively and trying to keep the mobility. That's good. I find a lot of people can get a little aggravated by using a barbell for their pressing. If you're one of those people, I would just go ahead and use some other variation. So I personally am someone who doesn't like barbell pressing that much. It's a great exercise, but it kind of aggravates my shoulders. So in that case, just go ahead and use something that gives you a bit more freedom of movement. Moving on from there, we go back to pulling, this time horizontal. So this will be a row variation. So really, almost any row variation is sufficient. I wouldn't recommend a machine row at this stage, though, just because you really need to be building those patterns with compound movements. So barbell rows, dumbbell rows, kettlebell rows, they're all excellent. Even bodyweight rows using either the rings or kind of a low pull-up bar that you can get into a horizontal position with. All of those are excellent. Just make sure you're doing one with good form, focusing on the muscles of your mid and upper back and really getting that full range of motion. And then this is going to be a bit controversial, but for the horizontal pressing, I recommend a push-up variation above all else at this stage. The reason being that it's not that bench press or dumbbell presses are a bad exercise necessarily. I just feel that novices tend to not have very good pressing mechanics yet. And the push-up is an excellent exercise just to learn the very basic pressing mechanics. The other stuff besides the actual training. So within nutrition, again, you want to keep it simple. The first thing I recommend is actually just cutting the crap out. So rather than focusing on, oh, what's the healthiest thing I can eat? If you cut out the really processed food, refined foods with lots of sodium, like refined fats, carbohydrates, that kind of thing, you're going to find that just in the absence of those, you're going to feel a lot better and perform a lot better. Besides that, I recommend drinking plenty of water. That should be your main liquid that you're consuming throughout the day is water. There is a huge variety of diets that work for people based on genetics. Also just culture, personal beliefs, religion, etc. So I don't think it's fair to just recommend one size fits all. That's not really how it works. But for most people, it seems that prioritizing protein sources, high quality protein sources, healthy fat sources, so that would be things like coconut oil, avocado oil, fish oils, yogurts, like dairies, things like that, as well as olive oils, basically these minimally processed fats and oils, and then carbohydrate sources that contain fiber. So that's nuts and legumes, beans, things like that, beans, peanuts, fruits and vegetables. And so I find that if you're prioritizing getting your carbs from that place, you're going to get a lot of micronutrients in the process. I think it's good to determine your caloric goals at this stage. So, looking at your body composition and determining whether you want to lose weight, maintain where your body weight is at, or gain weight. Generally speaking, if you're eating a reasonable amount, you're going to gain muscle mass because it's just a very beginning stage. So you can still do a maintenance diet at this point and potentially gain a decent amount of muscle mass just because you're an absolute beginner and you're starting from, square one. So I would say with this, something that's important to consider is body image. So when I say determining your caloric goals, this is something where you're consulting a physician, a nutritionist, etc., somebody with expertise. It's not just based on arbitrary beauty standards or self-image. I really want to emphasize this, particularly with teenagers and people who are kind of that impressionable age. You don't want to sabotage your health. You just need to do the best thing you can to avoid getting into these harmful eating behaviors that can really cause a lot of damage down the road. With that being said, as long as you are being careful about your body image, trying to be as objective as possible about these things, a rate of realistic weight gain or weight loss is about up to 1 pound a week. Anything beyond that is pretty extreme and not recommended. So that's about a 500 calorie difference. So in the case of weight gain, that's about an extra 500 calories a day more than what you're burning. For weight loss, that's an extra 500 calories a day less. 500 calories a day less than what you're burning. Anything beyond that is going to be pretty extreme, pretty unsustainable. And you can always, and I want to emphasize this, you can always go slower on this. And I think slow and steady is much more realistic for people. If you are kind of getting into weight gain and weight loss for the first time and you're just trying to see how your body's tolerating it, doing a lighter gain or lighter weight loss phase is going to probably be the practical thing, where you're just perhaps, modifying your caloric intake by 200 or 300 calories instead of this higher number. You're going to find that's a lot more tolerable for your body and a lot more sustainable, potentially, than just going balls to the wall and going for these kind of steeper calorie changes. As far as sleep and recovery go, setting a consistent sleep schedule, making sure you're getting enough quality sleep to recover. If you're not somebody who naps, it's definitely recommended, particularly if you're in a position where you aren't always able to get a full night's of sleep. Napping can be something that's very good for supplemental sleep. As far as recovery goes, you want to schedule what's called a deload every 3 to 6 weeks of training. So after training 3 to 6 weeks, you are essentially doing 1 week where you are doing much less intensity. So you want to cut the volume that you're working with about in half. You want to cut the intensity down dramatically. You're really doing just enough exercise that you're still getting some exercise, but you want to give your body time to recover from the fatigue that it's accumulated over time. And what this does is it allows you to keep progressing And oftentimes beginners will hit a point of stagnation. They don't know what they're doing wrong, and it's really just that they need to do a deload for a week and come back fresh. But so to wrap all this up, I just want to emphasize that this stage is really about building good habits and building a foundation above all else in order to prevent injury or stagnation or health risks down the road. Don't worry so much about the speed of progress. Just be patient with yourself, learn a little bit as you go, and be realistic with your goals. I hope this was helpful. I'll probably go ahead and, if this is well received, make the beginner one next for kind of that 6 to 18 month window where you're really starting to get into training, and then intermediate and advanced after that. So if you have any questions, concerns, just needs for clarification, go ahead and leave comments below. And obviously give this video a like so that it can get to more people.